Okay, guys, today we're going to be looking at Indicator 1.5, which involves the U.S. Constitution. We just finished going over the Articles of Confederation, which was the United States' first Constitution. But this is going to be the document that replaces the Articles of Confederation, and this is going to be the document that we still have in place today. So with that being said, let's get into Indicator 1.5, dealing with the U.S. Constitution. So again, before we start, let's make sure that we understand what our learning objectives are going to be for this lesson. If you want to pause this and go ahead and write these down, you can. And we'll answer those at the end of the video lecture. But let's start with the first learning objective, which is to describe limited government. Tell me what limited government is. Explain republicanism and what republicanism is. Explain how the federal government shares power, how the Constitution addresses this idea of sharing power. Describe the Electoral College, its purpose, and why it was made. You should be able to answer that. Describe our nation's judicial system and who's involved in that judicial system. And then finally, list the Bill of Rights and what each one represents. So that would be the last one. And so those are your learning objectives. If you need to, pause the video and you can write these questions down, or you can come back to them at the end and write them down as well. So let's look at limited government as the first topic. So when we talk about limited government, we're talking about government that is limited in power, and usually it's limited by something. And in this case, our government is limited by the Constitution. The Constitution sets up the rules for our government. So with limited government, the government must be controlled and not infringe on the rights of the people. And that's exactly what the Constitution does. Of course, most of our elected officials get their power from the people. And our Constitution pretty much serves as a social contract with the people. Again, these are the rules. These are the things that are acceptable for our government, and the people have agreed on those rules. We have what we call republicanism, and what republicanism is when voters are represented by elected legislatures. So when we elect a House of Representative member, then that person is representing us. Of course, many of you probably know this. South Carolina is divided up into a few different districts, and each one of those districts elects a representative that pretty much carries the ideas of that particular district to Washington to express how their constituents or their people feel that live in these particular areas. So when we elect someone, we're electing them to represent us in Washington, D.C. in the House of Representatives. But republicanism is when voters are represented by elected legislatures. Again, these representatives are going to make decisions that are in the best interest of the voters that they are representing. So someone from Horry County would go to Washington, and they're going to express their views based on the views of the people of Horry County. The House of Representatives is to ensure the interests of the voters, which I just mentioned. There's districts within South Carolina, and each one of those districts elects a representative that goes to the House of Representatives in Washington. And remember, in the last lesson, we discussed how our legislature is divided into two houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate. And the people that are in both of those houses are people that we voted on to put into those positions to represent us. Again, the Senate is to ensure the interest of the state. And remember, every state has 2 senators. Each one of those senators represents the interest of the entire state. And we have 2. We have one for the lower state and one for the upper state. Now, when we look at one of the ways that the Constitution tries to balance power, there are a couple of things that were built into the Constitution that would help achieve this. The idea of federalism is that states have certain powers which would limit the national government. And of course, we've talked about what a federalist system is, and that's when the states and the national government share power. But federalism is saying that the states have certain powers and the national government has certain powers. Again, by doing this, you got the whole nation versus states' rights. So you have of course, federal powers versus state powers, and sometimes they conflict. And we have had cases like that just recently. But sometimes the federal government overrules some of those state rights or state laws, and then sometimes the state law, is pretty much going to take out whatever the federal government is saying. So sometimes those things do come into conflict. Remember that the government is divided into three separate branches. This was another way of balancing power. If you look up in the upper right-hand corner, you see the idea of checks and balances. What checks and balances are is that each branch of government is going to have certain privileges that can be checked by other branches. So the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch can all check each other and can sort of make sure that each one of those branches are abiding by the rules that are set up by the Constitution. This also ensures that no one branch has more power than the other. So they sort of have to answer to each other. And we're seeing that play out even today in some of the things that have gone on recently. Again, there are three branches. The legislative branch includes our Congress, which is the House of Representatives, and the Senate. The House and the Senate can veto each other's bills, so they're sort of checking each other. Then we have the judicial branch, which is the court system, the federal court system made up of the Supreme Court, the Court of Appeals, and the district courts. You definitely want to write these down. You might even want to draw this diagram in your notes to make sure you know what each branch is and what each branch can do to the other. And then we have the executive branch. The executive branch is the office of the president, his cabinet, and independent government agencies. You can read through this and sort of see how each one can check each other and make sure that no one branch has too much power. Another thing that was built into our government is the Electoral College. Now, the Electoral College was set up by our founding fathers, and this is the way that we elect our president and vice president. The way you come up with how many representatives are for each state in the Electoral College is by taking the number of House of Representative members and their two senators. And if you look at this down at the bottom, you can sort of see how that plays out. South Carolina has 9, which means that South Carolina has 7 House of Representative members and 2 senators. Georgia, on the other hand, has 16, which means they have 14 House of Representative members and 2 senators. Now, you can also see that some states carry a lot of weight, like California. California gets to cast 55 electoral votes, which means that they have 53 members in the House of Representatives. And remember, the House of Representatives is based on population, and everyone gets 2 senators. So California, during the presidential election, plays a huge role because of the number of representatives, House of Representative members that they have. And of course, they get to cast more votes than, say, South Carolina, who only has 9. California has 55. But the total number will go towards the candidate who would win the popular vote in that state. So, for instance, in this one, you would notice that whoever won California, which In 2016, it was Hillary Clinton. You'll notice that that state is blue, which meant that Hillary Clinton got 55 electoral votes in the last election, presidential election. You notice all the states in red would have been the states that went to Donald Trump. So this can sort of give you an idea about where these people were voting. The blue representing Democrat, the red representing Republican. The reason why the Electoral College was put into place was it was to serve as a buffer from the impact of the popular vote. And of course, this argument is being addressed even to this day. Some people even want to get rid of the Electoral College. Some people argue for the Electoral College. And the main argument for keeping the Electoral College is that none of these states in red would count if you just went by the big states and by the popular vote, because then you would have California and New York and some of the larger states really picking your president, and then the states in red who have smaller numbers of electoral votes wouldn't be able to really have a voice in the presidential election. So that's mainly the reason why the Electoral College was put into place. The Constitution also sets up a judicial system. Our judicial system is made up of the Supreme Court, the Court of Appeals, and all the other federal courts that are out there. Again, the judicial branch is courts and judges, the federal courts and federal judges. These people are not elected. Usually they are appointed. And you can look here on the right and you can see some of the Supreme Court justices and who appointed them, what president. And the Supreme Court plays a major role for a lot of reasons, is because when they're appointed, they're usually going to be people that sort of carry the same views and ideas as the president who appointed them. So, when you're picked by one of these presidents, then more than likely you're going to carry a lot of the same views and ideas of that particular president. The Supreme Court is the highest court of the land. It hears cases that might violate rights, usually cases that involve violation of the Constitution. So that's usually when the Supreme Court gets involved in any court cases. Again, the Supreme Court judges are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. We just had two that were appointed recently by Donald Trump. So again, those justices are going to carry some of the ideas and views of Donald Trump, mainly the Republican Party. Usually these judges are going to serve for life. Now, you can retire, which has happened, but most of them do serve out most of their term. The other thing that the Constitution does is it creates a Bill of Rights. And remember, that was one of the sticking points that the Anti-Federalists wanted before they would agree to ratify the Constitution, was that it had to have a Bill of Rights. We're just going to run through these real quick. You might want to jot these down, put these in a chart form, just like you see here, and make sure that you understand what each one of these rights are. And of course, our First Amendment are our basic freedoms, freedom of speech, and so on. Freedom of speech, religion, press, assembly, and the right to petition. Amendment 2 in the Bill of Rights is self-protection, which is your right to bear arms, which most of you know that one. Amendment 3 is quartering of troops. Now, this is not really an issue today, but back during the Revolution it was, because the British troops would just basically walk into someone's house and take it over, and they had to feed them and take care of them and all this kind of stuff. So they thought that was pretty bad, so they included that in on the Bill of Rights. Amendment 4 is search and seizure. You got to have a warrant, you got to have probable cause before you can, enter someone's house, and so on. Amendment 5, or the Fifth Amendment, is the right of the accused. You got to have a right to a jury, you got to have a right to due process, and you must have the right to be able to confront your accuser. Amendment 6 deals with criminal trials, that the criminal trials should be speedy, they should be public, should have an impartial jury and a lawyer that would represent you. So that's the Sixth Amendment. The Seventh Amendment deals with civil trials. This is your right to a trial by jury. The Eighth Amendment limits fines and punishments, so you can't put some astronomical figure on a crime. You can't have excessive bail, and you can't be subjected to cruel and unusual punishment. So they can't rip your fingernails out or anything crazy like that. The Ninth Amendment are the rights of the people. You cannot use your rights in order to harm someone else. So again, rights of the people is the Ninth Amendment. The 10th Amendment are the powers of the states and people, and that any power that is not listed in the Constitution are reserved for the states. So that is the 10th Amendment. And that is going to do it for indicator 1.5. Hopefully you've written all these down. You've got them in your notes. You understand them. Now go back and make sure that you address your learning objective questions. So let's go back and look at those real quick. And your learning objective questions, again, write these down. Describe limited government. Explain what republicanism is. Explain how the federal government shares power. Describe the Electoral College, its purpose, and so on. Describe our nation's judicial system, who's in it, what makes it up, and so on. And then list the Bill of Rights and what each one of those rights represents. Okay, that's going to do it for 1.5, and I will catch you guys on the next one.